Welcome everybody to our monthly Wisdom from the Field webinar from Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. I'm Keith Anderson, and I'm the Associate for Digital Content at Lifelong Learning, and also I'm the pastor at Upper Dublin Lutheran Church in Ambler, Pennsylvania. And we have a great webinar in store for you today with Natalie Conway and Maggiano about their story at Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore and what we can learn from that for our own ministry contexts. So we're brought to you by Lifelong Learning at VTS, and we have monthly webinars, and those alternate between building faith, so practical ministry advice, which this is today, and also eFormation, our digital learning community, so how we use digital tools for ministry and faith formation. So we alternate months. This month is building faith, practical advice for ministry, and next month will be an eFormation webinar. It's the, you found us, so you know it's on Thursdays, 3 o'clock. So we invite you to come back for those. It's the same link that you use for today for all the webinars. So you just log into that link or sign up and you'll get all of the reminders for the upcoming webinars. So let's begin with a scripture reading, Repairing the Breach, from the book of Isaiah. Is not this the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. And this quote from Brian Stevenson. To me, the great evil of slavery was the narrative of racial difference, the ideology of white supremacy that we created to make ourselves feel comfortable with enslaving people who are Black. We've never addressed that legacy. We're so fortunate today to have two amazing ministers and presenters, both from Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore and involved in many other ministries around the church. I'm going to introduce you to Natalie Conway, and Natalie is the past president of the Standing Committee of the Diocese of Maryland. She's a vocational deacon currently serving at Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore. And prior to ordination, she had a significant career at the U.S. State Department. And Maggiano is the rector of Memorial Episcopal Church in Baltimore, where he's served since 2016. Prior to that, he was an associate priest at Trinity Cathedral in Miami. Very appropriate for today, not a winter passes that his family does not remind him that they could all be at the beach. And I would say that Gray is at an undisclosed, very warm location today. While Natalie and I are in the cooler Northeast. So this is going to be our structure for the webinar today. Each webinar we do some presenting and share some content, and then we pause for a Q&A. So we would love to hear your questions and observations, and you can do that in two ways. Along the bottom of your screen, you'll see some toolbar and some buttons. There's a button that has chat, and you can share your questions at any time in the chat as we're sharing, or in the Q&A for question and answer. Either one of those would be fine. So as thoughts occur to you, as questions occur to you, feel free to put those in the chat. And then when we pause each time, we'll come back to the chat and I'll share those questions with Natalie and Gray, and they can respond to you. So for the first section of the webinar today, Gray is going to share on racism in the church and uncovering our history. We'll break for Q&A, and then Natalie is going to share what happens when the story becomes personal. And then again, we'll have some Q&A with you as well. And with that, I will come to our next slide, and I'm going to hand it over to Gray.
Back to that last slide first.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to talk about the plaque.
Great.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being on this webinar with us. And I really appreciate everyone's interest in this story, and I hope that it makes you interested in your own story as well. So what you have in front of you is just a picture of a plaque Memorial Church is a sort of unique church in the Episcopal Church in that we're not a St. Peter's or St. Swithin's or a Trinity or a something. Memorial Church. I noticed someone on here is from what was Robert E. Lee Memorial, now Grace Memorial Church. So we're not the only church like this in the Episcopal Church. But it's pretty out of character for Episcopal churches to be a memorial to something other than a saint or to God. But we are a memorial to the two founding rectors of the church. You see in front of you a plaque, John's, and the date on there, 1864, is the date that the church was consecrated. They laid the ground, the cornerstone in 1860. And if you are at all aware of American history, you recognize that those are some fairly significant years in the life of our country, with the beginning of the Civil War. And so the church was really built during the Civil War. So we can go to the next slide. So to Memorial and being a part of the Memorial community, you always knew that there was something a little different about our history, but we never really dug into it. So I want to start by just acknowledging that this did not begin as an effort to sort of identify how terrible we are. There's often a sort of thinking or an ideology in America right now that we have to sort of beat ourselves or in the past to acknowledge how great we are today. And I think that may be a noble effort in the secular world, but in the religious world and in the faith world, that really doesn't help. And the conversation that began by asking the question, sort of the big question I think all Episcopal churches are asking, which is how do we become the beloved community? And that's a question I hope all of you are asking in your own parishes. And then it was a more specific under that, which is, why is this church so white? And that's an important question in Baltimore. Memorial Church is located in downtown Baltimore. The neighborhood that we're in is about 50% African-American, 50% white. The broader city of Baltimore is about 70% African-American. So the first question that came to mind was just, well, if we're a church that's committed to justice and committed to full inclusion and is a place that is open to everybody, that 160 some years after we were founded, we are still such a white institution. And not just in our leadership and our structure, but practically in membership. When I arrived here, there were maybe 4 or 5 active African-American members in the parish. So out of 300 members on the rolls, it's not a big number. So which brings me to this slide here in front of you. You see the lies that we tell ourselves, and often personal lives, professional lives, family lives, we like to think of ourselves as better than we used to be. And so looking back at the history of the church, when I started to ask questions about the history, we knew in the 1950s, they fired Arthur C. Kelsey, who was the rector of the church. He was, I think, 1955, he was asked to leave Memorial. And when I asked what that was about, because that was a pretty, a time of a lot of, everyone told me that it was because he was fired because he was trying to invite poor white coal miners to the church, and the church wasn't going to tolerate that. It had nothing to do with race. This wasn't a racist place, but it was about class, and that was a long time ago. So that didn't quite resonate. Didn't quite square with me. So we started to look at the vestry minutes, and if you see on the other side of it's from the vestry minutes there. And you'll see it in October 30th, 1955, the vestry voted against integrating the youth center that we cooperated with another church, even though it was pointed out that both the General Convention and the World Council of Churches opposed segregation. We decided to keep this institution that we operated a segregated institution. And then you see the next year, 1956, this is the note was a lively thrash. If any Negroes are to have in the forthcoming mission of visiting of homes. This was an effort to re-enliven the life of the parish by going door to door and knocking on each door to invite people to church. And essentially said, that's great, but we're not going to knock on the doors of Black people. And you see a couple quotes below from members of the vestry in the 1950s, being very blatant about their racism and their Black people being a part of the church and part of the community. And the one in particular at the bottom is, that the rector was rumored to have associated with Negro groups, and he wanted to know what the facts were. And this was because he was, participated in the NAACP, which was very active in Baltimore at the time. They were still, doing a lot of work on civil rights. And the rector was seeking to be involved in those things, and he was told blatantly not to do that. And because he wasn't willing to back down, he was asked to leave. So let's go to the next slide, if you don't mind, Keith. So then, we knew that piece of the history, so then we wanted to go back to the beginning. How did the church start? And you see on the left-hand side is the Constitution, the founding document of Memorial Church, and the only people who were allowed to be voting members of the church were free white males who were 21 years of age or older. You may be familiar with the phrase free white and 21, which, in another era was used as an expression of what it means to, you couldn't be freer than that. And of course, the dark underside of that means that Black people can never actually be free. I think a lot of churches likely have history like that. Some of it is that was the reality of who could vote in the state of Maryland at the time. So it wasn't that we were alone in this, but it's important. We were founded in the same way many other institutions in this country were founded, on the basis that only white people could make decisions, and often only male white people of a certain age and economic status could make decisions. The other half of the slide is the eulogy for Henry Van Dyke Johns, who you saw on the plaque on the first slide. Henry Van Dyke Johns died in 1859, made as a memorial to him first. And that effort was led by Charles Ridgely Howard, who was Johns' associate at another church. And Charles Ridgely Howard also died during the construction of the church. So they made it a memorial to both Johns and to Howard. But what is here is the eulogy to Henry Van Dyke Johns. And you can see it is glowing in its assessment of him, and his ministry in the city of Baltimore. But we also know that he had enslaved at least 40 people in his home, and was a avowed supporter both of the Confederacy and of the institution of slavery. His brother, who was the Bishop of Virginia and Robert E. Lee's chaplain during the war, their family had a large estate south of Annapolis where they likely had many, many more slaves. The reality for our church and for many churches is that we have eulogized and lifted up and memorialized people who, in retrospect, are not as great as we thought they were. This is not to say that any of us are as great as we think we are, and our generation will be looked back on for likely similar things, and we don't know what those things will be. And that's part of the we should all do. But we have to acknowledge a little bit of that past. So let's go to the next slide, and then I'll be quiet and take some questions. So, the Episcopal Church has a complicated history around racism, and almost every church has a story to tell. We did a Good Friday prayer walk, Stations of the Cross around our community, where we highlighted places where incidents of these kind of racist activities and racism took place that had been led by our church. We knew that it was the rector of the church, as you can see on the left, who dedicated the monument to the Confederacy. That was one of the monuments that was here in Baltimore. This is the Reverend William Meade Dame, was the rector of Memorial for 40 years, from the 1880s. And was very active Baltimore. He was the chaplain to the Daughters of the Confederacy. You can see on the other screen there where they were awarding crosses to the Daughters of the Confederacy. He was also chaplain to the Confederate veterans of Baltimore, and very active in Confederate activities post-Civil War. He was also very politically active. He wrote letters to the editor in support of amendments to take away the right to vote from Black people. He worked very hard to keep both the city and the community around the church segregated in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of everything else. Only one. So with this information from both the beginning of the story and the end of the story, we then began to dig in and look at newspaper articles and vestry minutes and other, contemporary historical accounts to get a sense for how complicit our church was in the legacy of slavery that Brian Stevenson talks about, the continuation of the subjugation of people of color and Black people in particular in the United States after the Civil War, where we continue to take away rights to vote, rights to education, rights to, to equal housing, to equal anything. And we discovered that the church was very active. In fact, the model for housing segregation in the United States, the idea of neighborhood compacts where you would keep whole neighborhoods or blocks segregated, was invented in our parish hall. The Mount Royal Protective Association led the Supreme Court effort to keep neighborhoods and communities segregated. It was two lawyers from the church, one of whom also served as chancellor for the Diocese of Maryland, who led that effort. They had every block around the church who were responsible for watching out to see if any Black people tried to buy houses or move into the neighborhood. And this effort was ongoing into the 1950s and 60s. I think we think of these things as being a long time ago, but well within the lifetime of people within our church, well within the lifetime of people within the broader community. And in fact, Memorial as an institution didn't 1969 when the Reverend Barney Farnham was called as rector. And the first thing he did the very day he was installed was he had one of the co-presiders at his installation be the African-American rector of Sharp Street United Methodist Church, to make it clear both to the church and the community that the church was going in a different direction. So I lift all this up to invite people to kind of consider their own history and consider that question of the beloved community and how well does your particular community, your church, your organization, your neighborhood reflect the beloved community? And if it doesn't, what questions ask to understand why? I think it's a lot of people, when I kind of give these talks or talk about this, say, well, you did so much research, that must be so hard, we could never do that. So as an exercise, I just yesterday spent about an hour doing random Episcopal church. I picked Christ Church in Warren, Ohio. I don't know if we have anyone on here from Warren, Ohio. I only picked it because my grandfather was born in Warren, Ohio. And that it just, I thought, well, I wonder if, another part of my family history story what does that look like? And Christ Episcopal Church in Warren, Ohio was founded in 1836. It existed in downtown until it moved outside of the city and it built a new campus, and that happened in 1957. Why 7, you might ask? If you're familiar with Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court case that desegregated schools, that became a bright spot for a lot of separation, a lot of people who were segregationists moving out of cities, town areas, and into more suburban areas so they could protect themselves from what they saw as a kind of Negro invasion. And that's their language, not mine. I don't know if that's why Christ Church moved. They could have moved for a lot of other reasons, but just by looking at the date, it deserves some additional questions. And there are some nationwide dates like that. The 1950s is one with Brown v. Board of Education, 1969 after assassination and sort of the nationwide uprising in Black communities after that is another one of those times. At the end of World War II, as cities are dealing with an influx of predominantly African-American workers to do work in factories to support the war effort. And of course, the post-Reconstruction Great Migration period from sort of the 1890s to the 19. You also had a lot of churches and communities moving and taking action because they were suddenly seeing very different kinds of neighbors and very different kinds of communities. And so just looking at any church history and looking at those periods, you know, the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and seeing, you know, what they have been involved in is a good way to get started on this effort. So I'll stop there and invite some questions.
Yeah, please, if you have questions, you can share it in the Q&A box. You could share it on the chat window. We'd love to hear what you're thinking and what your questions might be. I don't see any questions yet. I had a question for you. What has been the time frame for this? It's a lot of digging up history and we've talked before about some of this and thinking about, you know, where one gets started. So how long have you been kind of working on this with the congregation?
I'd say we started this we did the first, you know, Uncovering Our Racism Good Friday walk in 2017. Mm-hmm. So it's been about 2 years that we've been engaged in this work to lift up this story.
Great. Question from Tempest. When did the Black Episcopalians start, and might it be tied to this history? In either of you know?
The Black Episcopal Church, you know, has a couple different iterations, and I'm not an expert on the history of the Black Episcopal Church. But in Baltimore, the first Black Episcopal Church was founded in 18, and that was St. James Church. It's notable because it was the first church south of Mason-Dixon, first Black Episcopal Church south of the Mason-Dixon line, and it was founded before the Civil War, which meant it was free blacks in a slave state that had their own church. What's important about that story is that they were allowed to be a Black Episcopal Church, but it's actually unclear whether they were allowed to vote at diocesan convention and whether they were allowed to actually be a part of the broader Episcopal Church. And there's a long history, and I saw, you know, Riley Temple is on the call as well. He may know more about this, but there was a long history of advocating for separate Black bishops for Black churches, so they didn't have to mix with the white congregations.
Riley says Baltimore had the largest number of free blacks in the United States during slavery.
Yes, yeah.
And also had a question, which was, what prompted the study of race and Memorial Church? So what got you started?
What really got us started was digging into this inconsistency where we called ourselves a church that was open and inclusive to all, but we were still a predominantly 95, 98% white church in a city that's 70% Black. And if we really were inclusive, why wasn't it showing up in our light, in our.
Great. We'll continue to the next part. Oh, hang on one second. We've got a Q&A here, which I'll come to in a second. I'll grab that. But no more in the chat. I'm going to come back to that Q&A. So why don't we continue? Well, there's the questions, comments. And I'll hand it to Natalie to share about what happens when a story becomes personal.
Good afternoon. So deacons here in the Diocese of Maryland are assigned by the bishop. And when my assignment was finished at my last parish, he said, would you like to go to Memorial? And I said, sure, because I was born in Baltimore and I really am an urban girl, even though I live in the county, but it sounded good to me. So at the time, my brother and I were doing our genealogy, and he took my mother's side of the family and I took my father's side of the family. And he discovered through a cousin that, no, let me go back, that there may have been some ancestors at the Hampton, they called it a manor, we'll call it a plantation, just outside the Baltimore County line. So the two of us went to the mansion, took the tour, and in one of the rooms, they listed the enslaved people who were at Hampton Mansion. And one of those enslaved families were the Cromwells, which is my mother's maiden name. And we kind of looked at each other and said, I'm not sure about all of this. And then he learned from a distant cousin that, yes, the Cromwells were at Hampton Plantation, and their records, and there's an ethnological study that was done, and the names are mentioned. Well, that was just mind-blowing. That right here in, not that far away from the church itself, was this plantation where my ancestors were enslaved. Well, then we checked a little bit more, and my brother said, one of the founding rectors, or the rector of the church, was a Charles Ridgely Howard. And I said, where have I seen that name? And I was sitting in the back of the church at a pew and looked up at a plaque for Charles Ridgely Howard. I was stupefied, is probably the best word I could say politely. And that next Sunday, I talked to Gray, and I said, I need to tell you that I almost walked out. I was a little angry, maybe a lot angry, and I didn't know how to handle it. And I told him the story, and he said, you have to tell the story. No, go pray about it. So I did, and the good Lord said, go tell the story. Still difficult, still trying to process, but this church, Memorial Church congregation, once they heard the story, got real involved. And we took a bus trip out to the Hampton Mansion with an African-American church, St. Catherine's. And here you see us standing in a prayer circle, and what Steve and I are doing, and this was on purpose, to have our hands pour blessed water on the grounds of Hampton Mansion. Both hands pouring as an act of, I like to say reparations, because it's a repair. It's a repair and a reconciliation. I saw the film Harriet, and the slave quarters in the film looked exactly like the slave quarters at Hampton. And it really struck my heart that the fact that why would somebody want to enslave another person? And just to see the chains and the leg irons made it more personal than just reading it in a book or seeing a movie. So it has become something that I'm learning how to talk about a lot more.
Let's see what our next slide is. The Hampton Lineage. And this is from the plantation?
Yes, it's from their little pamphlet that they hand out. And those are all, it's amazing because there's lots of Charleses, and ironically enough, my, I think she's going to be my great-great-great-grandmother, we're still digging, was a Harriet. And there are lots of Harriets. so timelines are hard to come up with. But we know that she was there in 1804 and that she was freed by Charles Kernan Ridgely in 1829 when she turned 25. Before the war.
The document on the screen there is from Charles Kernan Ridgely's will. And in his will, he freed all of his slaves, but there was a caveat. Natalie, do you want to talk about what that caveat was?
Yes, if a woman had a child who was 4 years of age or less than 4 years old, the child had to stay there at Hampton.
Mm. Mm.
It was, still separating families, and then the children became, what's the word I want? They had a new family, but they were being like held hostage because they couldn't go anywhere until they were 25.
Oh, wow. Mm.
And then Nancy, I can't think of what Nancy's last name was. Great.
Davis?
Nancy Davis was freed at 25. And from what I understand, she went into Baltimore. And Baltimore was a strange place for her. And she could not handle, quote, the big city. So she went back to Hampton and became a nanny to one of the Ridgely family's children.
Mm. Mm.
The story of Nancy Davis is particularly interesting. She's the only Black person who has a grave at Hampton. They suspect they have other unmarked graves, but she has a gravestone in the Ridgely family cemetery. But her story is a challenging one, particularly for Memorial, because you see in the bottom of that Hampton lineage, there's a picture of Marguerite Sophia Howard and Charles Ridgely. And they were married, and when Marguerite's, the Howard family gave Ann Davis as a wedding present to the couple when they were married. There's no better way to phrase it than that. And so those were Charles Ridgely Howard's parents, Charles Ridgely Howard being the founder of Memorial Episcopal Church. And so she was likely the one who nursed him, raised him. And it shows just the deep brokenness in our country at that time, and should have us question, what have we done to repair that brokenness?
Mm. What kind of questions, comments? Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. And how has the response been sort of in the congregation? As the congregation's been learning its history, owning its history, going together to the plantation. What has been? I don't know if effect is the right word, but has it been difficult? Has it been healing? Has it been both of those things? And either of you could answer.
I think it's been healing. After we got back from the plantation, we just had to determine what we were going to do about the plaques at the back of the church. When I first saw them, I wanted to get a sledgehammer and knock them down. But what we decided, what Gray proposed, and the vestry said, go for it. We draped them. They are now draped until we, again, as a congregation, decide what to do with them. But right now they are covered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that has been healing for me.
And what we linked to the Baltimore Sun article in the information about the webinar, and if people haven't seen that, we'll include that with all the materials from the webinar. So people are noticing, paying attention. Has there been a response from your neighborhood or the community, or from that article, or from other churches?
Well, what started as a simple little story went viral. And more people have come to me and said, I went back and started to look at my history, which is a good thing. Go back and unearth it. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to unearth things that have been swept under the rug for 10 zillion years, and it's still happening. So the more we talk about it, the more we put it out there in the world, maybe more people would realize that we're really just one person, one body. And yes, there's been a lot of attention, and a lot of it has been from outside of Baltimore. Last weekend, Steve Howard and I were at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania talking about it. And there's about 40 people there, faculty and students, because they want to look into their history. And what better way to start than to have the two of us there to talk about it?
Natalie, what's the response been like from your family?
Again, my brother in particular, he said, I always thought of slavery and the history of slavery being an intellectual read, but when it became personal, I need to dig some more. I want to know. I want people to come down to Hampton and see. My sister's not so much into it. She never was into any type of history, but my brother and I have decided to keep digging.
It sounds like, we didn't start the webinar or the material about the webinar talking about reparations per se, though that increases, is in the news more with Virginia Seminary making a financial commitment to that, and Princeton Seminary more recently. And it's, in hearing your story, it sounds like you didn't prejudge the outcome of what you would do about this. It happened as part of a process. Now we are going to do this, but it's been a process for the congregation to figure out how to respond and what to do. Is that fair to say?
I think so. It's still a process. And you mentioned Virginia and Princeton and monetary commitment. And I actually said last week that I would like to see that money go where it's needed most, more towards social justice, more towards better schools, more towards better health care. I think that would make more of a difference if things were beginning to be on equal ground, because it's not. It is not.
Now, I think the process part of this is very important, because we recognize that there is no definitive end to the conversation. That the continue today, they're perpetuated today because of the legacy of slavery, won't disappear overnight, nor should our intentionality or focus on them disappear. But I was really happy. Our last parish retreat came by happenstance after tell her story, and we had visited Hampton Plantation. So we reframed the whole retreat around this question of what's next. And not only did we have some really great conversations about the plaques and about the name of the church and about what we do with those symbolic things, but also really about exactly what Natalie said about, how do we begin to right the wrongs on the ground, focus on social justice areas. We know the church was very involved in efforts to keep schools segregated and housing segregated. So what can we do to begin to repair that in a tangible, practical way? And it began some, I think, really robust conversations that will continue to, be both financial support to ongoing work, but also perhaps our own programs, our own efforts. And that out of this, comes resurrection. For us as a community, for our relationship with St. Catherine's that Natalie mentioned, and hopefully for our little corner of Baltimore.
We're happy to receive questions and comments. I'll share with you what we received. Riley said, "Thank God you told the story. Thank you, Reverend Conway."
Mhm.
And Anne said, "I too offer heartfelt thanks to Deacon Conway for sharing this moving story. God bless you." And some more powerful witness leaves me both dumbstruck and hopeful. If we can speak truth, we have hope of healing. Thank you. Yeah. Here's a question from Joy. Have any members of your congregation voiced opposition to this conversation? And if so, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, I think we are really blessed to have a group of people who I think really believe in Jesus and really believe that this is God's work that we're engaging in. I think that the one place where it's been interesting, people have really struggled, is the conversation around changing the name of the church. Because I think we identified this, that people who have been going to the church for a long time, they like the uniqueness of Memorial because it has in the last 50 years been a church that fought very aggressively for LGBT rights, for women's rights, and they had the first draft clinic in Baltimore. The Catholic worker movement started in our parish hall. A lot of really important social justice efforts that began at Memorial, and they see themselves as kind of unique, so they like Memorial as a moniker. So one of the conversations was, but also recognizing that, but it's a memorial to the wrong thing. So what do we do with that? Do we do like Grace Memorial did in Lexington and add something to the name or change the name? Do we rememorialize the church to something else? But that is something that I think I've been excited to have the conversation, even though they're uncomfortable with it, and have the conversation and what the result will be. And I think often we have fake conversations in the church where we already know what the results are going to be, so we're willing to talk about it. But that's not, I think, what we're doing at Memorial.
Carissa asks, I'd love to know more about the Black Friday walk you mentioned, where you began to uncover your racism. How was that organized and run? That began in 2017. We had collected a lot of information around particular incidents of racism the church had been involved in, and so we selected one for each Station of the Cross, and we carried a cross through the community and said the Stations of the Cross prayers and readings at each space. I won't go through, but two in particular I will highlight. One is we stopped in front of a home that's just a block and a half down from the church that in the 1920s, a Black Baptist pastor had bought the house, and he would have been the first Black person to live on that block. And he moved out of the house, or he went on vacation, I'm sorry. And when he came back from vacation, there was a for sale sign in the window and all his possessions were on the front stoop. And the neighborhood had conspired to because the tax assessor lived in the neighborhood and refused to file the taxes for the house. So he was evicted for not paying the taxes, even though they had been paid, just not filed. And that was part of a continuing effort by neighbors and parishioners to keep the neighborhood white. And then another, example, we stopped in front of a local elementary school, which is, 2 blocks away, and is where many of our members' kids now go to school. And place because there were quotes from members of our church in the Baltimore Sun when the school was founded, saying things like, well, it was founded as the first integrated school in the city of Baltimore, sorry. So there were quotes from the Baltimore Sun of parishioners saying things like, well, I wouldn't send my kid there because there won't be anyone that they're amenable to. Or I'm scared, or I'm worried about who they'd be friends with. And just, all of these different ways that our community and the broader neighborhood had been involved and been complicit in segregation. Partly as a result of that, which was the Mount Royal
Improvement Association. They dissolved themselves and reformed themselves as the Bolton Hill Community Association, because the Mount Royal name was attached to this organization that had kept the neighborhood segregated and fought to keep the neighborhood segregated. And so they felt it was important, the neighborhood as a whole felt it was important to legally re-identify who they were.
Wow. We have some questions in the Q&A. I'm gonna have to stop sharing my screen for the moment, I think, to access it. Yeah. Let's see. So Riley asked, will these materials be available for further distribution? Yep. The video and the slides, and there are resources in the slides I'll show you in a minute that will all be available. So if you're on this webinar, you'll automatically receive all of those.
And I can send a copy of the bulletin for the Saints of the Cross walks that we've done.
Great, great. And one attendee says, in what ways have you included racism as part of the worship service? You know, or have you addressed it in worship in some way? And if so, what's been the reaction to it?
Natalie, do you want to talk about homecoming and All Saints?
For All Saints was actually November the 1st. So we did a joint service with St. Catherine's of Alexandria, our I want to say partner. Is that good enough, partner?
Yeah, yeah.
An African-American church and us. And we included both people from both congregations to do different parts of the service. So we had some lectors from St. Catherine's, some lectors from Memorial, ushers, you know, whatever else you could do within the worship service. And I actually preached that service. And then we read the names from the billboard, I think, that we have outside of all the families who were enslaved or enslaved by the Ridgeleys at Hampton. What did we do for homecoming? That was a little bit, that was the next Sunday?
No, homecoming, you and Steve did.
Oh, say that again? You cut out a little bit.
Yeah.
Natalie, you did a litany of healing.
Oh, okay. Yes. I don't remember what happened last week.
So many worship services.
Yeah, yeah. And so we, like for prayers for the people, we did a litany of healing, and Steve and I did that together. So we're putting people together in a safe place, but knowing that you can take this safe place to another safe place to have conversation. So that was good. Yes, the litany.
And Lisa had a question. I'll read it and then. So she said, I heard a concern expressed relatively recently within a particular church that a newspaper pic of the rector at a community meeting about Black Lives Matter movement might say to public that everyone at the church agreed with BLM. And she said, is that code language? Which I'm not positive I quite understand that you may better than I do. But I think it's sort of interesting. It reminds me of the story from the 50s where your rector was associated with Negro groups, and that became a reason for his removal. So some things don't change.
My answer would be that, and maybe Natalie wants to reflect on what Black Lives Matter means to her, but my answer would be that every church is in its own particular context. And I fully recognize that for some clergy and some people to walk into a Black Lives Matter meeting or a surge meeting or any conversation is going to be much more tricky than for me. Baltimore is a very 70%, it's also a 70% Black city. So Black Lives Matter in Baltimore because Baltimore matters in Baltimore. It's a non-controversial thing, but it has become a term that in some circles may carry a different kind of weight. I'm not going to prejudge and the decisions they make and how they engage with the world around them, but I would encourage a way to engage with the context and the world around them in a manner that's faithful to the gospel and faithful to God's people. Thank you.
I just want to point out on our slides here, just so people can get a sense of what we'll be sending their way. We do have a resource list with the Baltimore Sun article and other links that people can check out also and share. And all of these materials will be sent out following. So I think we're right at about our time. And I just want to thank Gray and Natalie for sharing this remarkable story with us. And I echo, echo so many of the comments that we've received today, that thank you for your courage and for your perseverance and your openness to engaging these difficult issues in your parish, but then sharing that story more broadly to encourage the rest of us to think about ways that we can dig into our own histories, both congregations and personal, and to begin to tell the truth about ourselves and our churches. Yeah. So
thanks all for participating, and feel free to reach out via email or other methods to ask more questions.
All right.
I'll be glad to answer them.
Great, thank you. And we'll make that contact information available as well. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this webinar, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Bye.